Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You've heard it before, one of Jesus' most famous lines, but have you ever felt like it remains a bit enigmatic? Like something's missing? Well, for most readers, something is. In part 1, we uncovered why it's essential to read Jesus within his Jewish context. We saw how the distance between his world and ours can lead to distorted interpretations, especially when it comes to his most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. We explored the first major disconnect, what I call the reference gap, where missing the deep links to the Hebrew Bible causes us to misunderstand Jesus' words. And so sayings like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," take on new meaning once we realize that it echoes back to Isaiah 61. Even the "blessed are" repeated language in the Beatitudes is lifted straight from Psalm 119, a poetic passage that declares the blessed or fortunate state of those who walk in the way of God. When we connect these literary dots, "Blessed are the poor in spirit" becomes much clearer. But then there's the second part. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Ironically, that's the part most people think they understand, but as we'll soon discover, it presents yet another challenge. A second major gap that we'll address in this video, one just as crucial, but rarely discussed. For those of us who didn't grow up in Judaism, there's another contextual gap we need to acknowledge. As Westerners, we gravitate towards the broader Greco-Roman background of the Gospels, which shouldn't be ignored. But once we venture into the archives of Judaism, striking parallels emerge between Jesus and the teachings of early rabbis. Now, this isn't breaking news in academic circles, but for Christians today, this common ground remains virtually unknown. In fact, when rabbinic writings are quoted from the pulpit, it's usually for one reason: to highlight differences. Since this literature is incredibly vast and diverse with differing perspectives, it's easy to cherry pick a line or two that makes Judaism seem inferior. It's what I call the Cameo contrast effect. Jesus is made to shine by casting Judaism into shadow. Like a carved cameo that appears luminous only against a dark background, Jesus is often presented as brilliant, but only by contrast. In this rhetorical move, he's framed as radiant, novel, and morally elevated because Judaism is flattened into something rigid, lifeless, and distorted. But here's the truth. Jesus' brilliance and uniqueness stand on their own. Instead of rushing to highlight the differences, we need to pause and acknowledge the remarkable common ground. That shared culture and language doesn't just connect Jesus to his Jewish world. It helps us bridge another major divide between us and his words. This is what I call the Rabbinic Gap. And here's where it gets really interesting. So why call it the Rabbinic Gap instead of just the Jewish Gap? Because we need to be more specific about what stream of Judaism Jesus belonged to. Scholars remind us that first century Judaism wasn't monolithic. There were competing groups. That's true. But Jesus wasn't a Sadducee, aligned with temple elites and Hellenistic type philosophy. Nor was he an Essene, retreating to the Dead Sea like a sectarian. Jesus was part of what scholars call common Judaism, the mainstream movement centered around synagogue, Torah, and community life. He's often found engaging in the synagogue and interacting with fellow teachers, especially the Pharisees, who, like him, were deeply involved in interpreting the law for everyday people. You might be wondering, what exactly are these rabbinic writings? Well, the teachings of the rabbis were originally passed down orally, and then compiled into a foundational text called the Mishnah. Over time, layers of commentary were added, which formed the Talmud, one of the most influential texts of Jewish tradition. Now that we've set the stage, let's explore how rabbinic literature can deepen our understanding of the Gospels. To do that, we'll look at three aspects of Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount: his style, his sayings, and his speech, and compare them with rabbinic traditions. Let's begin with style. Since Jesus was known as a rabbi, it shouldn't surprise us that he also taught like one. A prime example of this is his use of parables, which make up about 1/3 of his lessons in the Gospels. Contrary to what you might have heard, Jesus did not invent the genre of parables. He was, without question, a master storyteller who captivated crowds. His parables were both impactful and memorable. However, this style wasn't unique to him. Rabbinic literature contains hundreds, even thousands, of parables similar to the ones Jesus shared. One fascinating thing about these parables is that they are all written exclusively in Hebrew, not Aramaic. You may have heard the claim that Hebrew was a dead language by the time of the 1st century, but that's simply not true. A complete and annotated collection of these narrative parables have been compiled into a volume called Parables of the Sages by scholars Notley and Safrai. They observe, for the most part, with the exception of those preserved in the New Testament, we do not find narrative parables in Greek and Roman literature, or even in other Jewish literature, i.e. Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. Indeed, the very appearance of parables attributed to Jesus in the Gospels indicates something of his place on the landscape of Judaism in the final decades of the Second Temple. The fact that this is his characteristic method of teaching is a clear indication that Jesus belongs to common Judaism. Storytelling and metaphor, of course, have always existed. Think of Aesop's fables or the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah. However, the specific style of the rabbinic parable, the mashal in Hebrew, appears only 2 places: rabbinic literature and the Gospels. This unique overlap underscores why incorporating rabbinic writings is essential for studying and understanding the New Testament. To illustrate this point, let's do a little experiment. Can you tell which of the following parables is from Jesus and which one is from rabbinic tradition? Parable number 1. Everyone whose wisdom is greater than his deeds, to what may he be compared? To a tree whose branches are many, but whose roots are few. The wind comes, uproots it, and topples it. But everyone whose deeds are greater than his wisdom, to what may he be compared? To a tree whose branches are few, and its roots are many. Even if all the winds in the world come and blow against it, they will not remove it from its place. And here's parable number 2. To what may the matter be compared? To a king who hired 2 laborers. One worked all day, and he gave him a denarius. The other worked only 1 hour, and he gave him a denarius. Which of them was favored? Was it not he that worked only 1 hour, and to whom the king gave a denarius? So which parable is from Jesus? Well, it's actually a trick question. They're actually both from rabbinic literature, and they both resemble other parables of Jesus. For example, the one with the trees and the storm likely made you think of this well-known parable that we see in the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, and the rivers came, and the winds blew and fell against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. And everyone hearing these words of mine and not doing them may be compared to a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And it fell, and great was its fall. While not identical, both parables share a striking similarity in language and lesson. The rabbinic parable uses the imagery of 2 trees, one with many branches and few roots, and another with few branches and deep roots. In contrast, Jesus' parable features 2 houses, one built on the rock and the other built on sand. Just as the deeply rooted tree withstands the strong winds, the house on the rock endures storms, emphasizing that a strong foundation comes from putting wisdom into action. Jewish parables share familiar real-life imagery, such as kings and servants, landowners and tenants, seeds and plants. Moreover, they focus on conveying one central spiritual lesson. As Christianity evolved, apart from Judaism, early church fathers began interpreting Jesus' parables allegorically, which often drastically altered the original meaning behind his greatest stories. Take the parable of the two houses we just read. According to an early commentary from the 4th century, the wise builder represents the Apostle Paul. The house represents the church. The rock is Christ. The torrents are kings. The winds are judges. And the foolish builder represents Jews. Did you catch all that? Well, sadly, for most of church history, allegorical interpretation was the dominant method. Studying Jesus' parables in the wider context of Jewish tradition just makes sense, and the many parallels are striking. If you'd like to learn more about the Hebrew background of the parables, I'll include some recommended resources below in the description. Before we move on from style, one clear difference between Jesus and the rabbis is how they delivered their teachings. Rabbis often introduce lessons with, "Rabbi so-and-so says," passing down oral tradition. Throughout the sermon, however, Jesus speaks on his own behalf. This stark contrast explains why the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. People will use verses like this to say, "See, Jesus had nothing to do with Judaism and the rabbis." They claim that this is proof that Jesus opposed all oral tradition. So how do we explain this? Again, rabbinic writings offer some insight. They say that when the Messiah comes, he will elucidate for them the words of the Torah and elucidate for them their errors. In other words, the Messiah wasn't expected to be an ordinary teacher. He would speak with divine authority, revealing the true meaning of Scripture and correcting false interpretations. With Matthew's repeated, "You've heard it said, but I say to you," it's clear that Jesus saw himself as fulfilling this role. In addition to parables, many sayings of Jesus are similar to those of other rabbis. There are many examples, but let's just compare 3 of some of his most recognizable sayings, all from his greatest sermon. First, let's consider the opening of the Lord's Prayer. "Pray then in this way, Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name." Contrary to popular belief, the invocation to God as Father wasn't a radical innovation by Jesus, nor was it an idea completely unheard of in Jewish liturgy, as some well-known theologians have claimed. God is first addressed as Father, not in the Gospels, but in the Hebrew Bible. However, the specific phrase, "Our Father who is in heaven," is not found anywhere, except, drumroll please, in rabbinic literature. The exact wording in Hebrew, "Avinu shebashamayim," can be found in Sotah 9 of the Mishnah, where it is repeated 3 times. The similar and more common phrase, "Your Father who is in heaven," which appears 8 times in the sermon, also appears in various Hebrew and Aramaic sources. Now, what about "Hallowed be thy name"? Well, the idea of hallowing or sanctifying God's name is also central to Judaism and is reflected in multiple sources. In fact, this concept opens one of the most important prayers still recited in synagogues today, the Kaddish. While the liturgy has evolved over time, many scholars believe its earliest versions date back to the 1st century. It reads, "Exalted and hallowed be his great name, in the world which he created according to his will." I should also just note that the 3rd line, "May his kingdom rule," is nearly identical to "May your kingdom come," yet another parallel with the Lord's Prayer. All right, let's look at a second well-known saying from Jesus. And this one gets a lot of mileage. "Do not judge so that you will not be judged," that is, come under divine judgment. "For with the judgment that you judge, you shall be judged. And with the measure that you measure, it shall be measured to you." Compare the first sentence with a saying from Hillel, a prominent rabbi from the 1st century BC, who, like Jesus, was known for his emphasis on empathy and kindness. Do not judge your fellow until you have reached his place. That is, don't criticize someone until you have been in his position or walked in his shoes. Both Jesus and Hillel share the same instruction, but provide a different perspective or emphasis. Now, notice how Jesus pairs the word judge with measure in the second part of his statement. This echoes the well-known rabbinic concept, midah keneged midah, meaning measure for measure. It carries the same idea as the English adage, what goes around comes around. As you can see, when you place Jesus' words side by side with this line from the Mishnah, the resemblance is unmistakable. With the measure you measure, it shall be measured to you. That's Jesus. With the measure that a man measures, it shall be measured to him. The Mishnah. The phrasing is nearly identical, almost word for word. Our third and last saying is the oft-quoted line, do unto others, also commonly known as the Golden Rule. Therefore, in all things, whatever you want people to do to you, so do to them, for this is the Torah and the prophets. Many people are not aware that the biblical basis for treat others the way you wish to be treated is actually Leviticus 19:18. Love your fellow as yourself. It's simply a rephrasing of the greatest commandment when you think about it. What's important to observe here is that Jesus doesn't just give us the golden rule. He presents it as a summary of all Scripture. Empathy for others is the essence of the Torah and the prophets, the core message of the Hebrew Bible. Now, I've heard this many times, but notice, Jesus isn't saying that the golden rule replaces the law and the prophets. He's not providing his followers with a shortcut as a reason to shelve the commandments. After all, he just spent a lot of time discussing them and explaining what true observance looks like. Instead, he's offering the golden rule as a guiding principle, a compass to help us navigate how to live out the commandments. Do the rabbis share a similar perspective? Rabbi Hillel certainly does. That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. This is the entire Torah. The rest is its explanation. Go study. Though the golden rule here is phrased negatively, here we have do not do unto others instead of do unto others, Hillel's version of the rule virtually conveys the same truth. Consideration for others is the central, overarching message of the Torah. I love how he ends with go study. By studying, we learn the specifics of how to walk in light of the golden rule.